Thank you. Thank you, Bishop Hugh. So, IVF is often a complementary element of another method of assisted reproduction, of surrogate motherhood. Surrogate motherhood is a technique which is usually used in cases where the female partner of the couple is unable to carry a child. So surrogate mother can be defined as a woman who carries a child pursuant to an arrangement which was made before she became pregnant and was made with the sole intention of the resulting child being handed over to another person or persons, and the surrogate mother relinquishing all rights to the child. There are two types of surrogacy, traditional and gestational surrogacy. In traditional surrogacy, the surrogate mother becomes pregnant with the sperm of the intended father, usually by insemination and seldom through sexual intercourse, or is inseminated with a donor sperm. In this case, the surrogate mother is genetically related to the child. In gestational surrogacy, an embryo is created by in vitro fertilization using either the egg of the intended mother or a donor egg, and the sperm of the intended father or a donor sperm. And as a result, in this case, the surrogate mother is not genetically related to the child. Surrogacy arrangements can also be categorized into altruistic and commercial surrogacy, depending on whether the surrogate mother receives a payment for her services or whether she doesn't receive any payment. Surrogacy as such attained public visibility over 2 decades ago in the mid-1980s through the notorious case of baby M in the United States. This case involved parties, the surrogate mother, Mrs. Whitehead, who was a traditional surrogate, so she was genetically related to the child, and she entered into an arrangement with the couple, Mr. and Mrs. Stearns. Mrs. Whitehead was inseminated by the sperm of Mr. Stern and delivered a baby girl. The baby was then taken up by the intended parents. The next day, however, the surrogate mother decided that she just couldn't live with the baby, and she took the baby from the intended parents. The father then obtained a court decision which confirmed an enforcement of the surrogacy arrangement, and Mrs. Whitehead, upon learning about this enforcement order, she took the child and fled to Florida. There she was apprehended, and the baby was removed by force and returned to the intended parents. She was finally awarded just visitation rights. So this was the first sort of major case which attracted the visibility of surrogacy. Since then, despite controversies over ethical aspects of surrogate motherhood, surrogacy has become an increasingly common method of reproductive technology. Domestic legal approaches to surrogacy differ widely between jurisdictions. Generally speaking, countries can be grouped into 3 categories: surrogacy-friendly jurisdictions, countries with a relatively neutral approach to surrogacy, and finally, anti-surrogacy jurisdictions. As for the surrogacy-friendly jurisdictions, these are in the minority and include, for example, countries like India, Thailand, Ukraine, Russia, and a number of US states, in particular California. In these countries, commercial surrogacy is legal. There are procedures in place which allow the intended parents to obtain legal parentage of the child, and there are no nationality, domicile, or habitual residence requirements for the intended parents. So intended parents from abroad are able to come, hire a surrogate mother, become the legal parents of the child, and then come back to their home country. As a result of this, these countries have become the hubs of international surrogacy, attracting intended parents from the anti-surrogacy jurisdictions and jurisdictions with a neutral approach to surrogacy. By and large, the majority of these intended parents are childless Western couples, either heterosexual or even gay couples, which is quite common. These are attracted by low-cost surrogacy services and the ready availability of poor surrogates in places, especially like India, where cross-border surrogacy has actually reached industry proportions. From the sort of international legal perspective, there is a complete void in the regulation of cross-border surrogacy, as none of the existing international instruments contain specific provisions to regulate this emerging area of international family law. In the absence of global regulation, highly complex legal problems arise, and among these the most prevalent are the problem of legal parenthood and the nationality of the child. So I'll just mention one practical case so that you would have an idea of what these problems are about. It was a case, 2008 case, X and Y foreign surrogacy, which came before the High Court in England. And in this case, a married British couple entered into a surrogacy arrangement with a married Ukrainian surrogate. The surrogate mother was implanted with embryos which were created using donor eggs and the sperm of the intended father. So she was a gestational surrogate and not genetically related to the child. She gave birth to a set of twins, and the problem was that under Ukrainian law, the British couple were considered to be the legal parents of the child. Under English law, however, the legal parents of the twins were the surrogate mother and her husband. So the conflict between the English and the Ukrainian law resulted in parental status being lost for both couples, and this left the children without any legal parents and without rights to either British or Ukrainian nationality. So as a result of this, the children were marron stateless and parentless, whilst the couple could neither remain in the Ukraine nor bring the children to the UK. So they were basically stuck there, but their visas were running out, so they had to leave Ukraine. So in the end, following a long delay due to DNA tests, the children were granted a discretionary leave to enter the UK, and the court pointed out that it was outside the rules to make it possible for the couple to apply for a parental order under the Human Fertilization and Embryology Act. And the decision was based on the principle of the welfare of the child. So basically there was nothing else the court could do, because the welfare of the child required that they would be looked after by the intended parents, because the surrogate mother was not interested in looking after these children. So in addition to the difficulties concerning legal parentage and the nationality, a number of other problems can easily be envisaged. So what happens if the child is born with serious disabilities and the intended parents refuse to look after the child? At a later stage, other complications may arise, such as cross-border custody and access dispute between the intended parents residing in one country and the surrogate mother in another, or a dispute over maintenance and financial support, or a dispute over international child abduction. Legal problems arising from cross-border surrogacy are, however, not the only cause for concern. Another great worry is the potential for a black market, and this concern is particularly legitimate in cases of commercial surrogacy. These objections, ethical objections against surrogacy, in particular commercial surrogacy, can be summarized as follows. Commercial surrogacy involves commercialization of conception, reduction of women to their childbearing capacity, and commodification of women's bodies and children. Another objection against surrogacy is that it involves exploitation of women in developing countries due to a disparity of status between the surrogate mothers and intended parents. There are concerns over physical well-being of the surrogate mothers. in particular concerns over the placement of multiple embryos into the surrogate mother's wombs. In one particular case, which came before the High Court, there were 5 embryos placed in the womb of the surrogate mother in India. So, concerns over physical well-being. Another concern, more general, is displacement of resources from adoption to surrogacy. The argument is that in a world where millions of orphan children or abandoned children in the developing world are in need of families, there is no need to produce more children, and inter-country adoptions should instead be encouraged as an alternative to surrogacy. There is also the risk of commissioning children for sinister purposes, including pedophilia, other forms of physical or psychological abuse. And indeed there was a case, it was a domestic surrogacy case in the US where a single man commissioned a genetically unrelated child through a traditional surrogacy arrangement in Pennsylvania, and the baby died 6 weeks after the birth as a result of physical abuse. So there is concern of this sort. Concerns over trafficking in women and children. There was a Belgian case where a Belgian surrogate entered into a surrogacy arrangement with a Belgian couple, and then she later informed the couple saying that she had miscarried whilst basically auctioning the baby on the internet and trying to sell the baby to a Dutch couple. Another case was a case of a well-known Californian surrogacy lawyer who was jailed recently for involvement in a baby selling scheme where surrogate mothers were promised up to $45,000 to travel to the Ukraine to be implanted with embryos that would then be offered for sale during the 3rd trimester. And actually this lawyer was supposed to participate in our research, so you can see how sort of tricky area it is. Another concern is potential for abuses related to sex selection, pre-implantation diagnosis, and selection of physical characteristics, especially where donor gametes are used, so-called commissioning of designer babies. A fierce criticism has been directed in particular to the Indian commercial surrogacy market. One Indian commentator has expressed the view that commercial surrogacy in India mirrors the plight of the poor of an underdeveloped country who are willing to sell something as sacred as their women's motherhood. The dark sides of the Indian surrogacy market were described as follows. Exploitation, extortion and ethical abuses in surrogacy trafficking are rampant, go undeterred, and surrogate mothers are misused with impunity. It is a free trading market flourishing and thriving in the business of babies. It is alarming that these concerns are not purely theoretical, but they are substantiated by empirical findings. There was a research study carried out by the Indian Center for Social Research called Surrogate Motherhood, Ethical or Commercial. And this study has revealed a number of areas of concern, including, first, delay in signing contracts. Contracts were often not signed until the 4th month of a pregnancy, when the risk of miscarriage was lower than at the early stage of pregnancy. So as a result, if the surrogate mother miscarried before the contract was signed, she was not entitled to any fee or proportion of the fee. Another problem was the motivation for becoming a surrogate mother. Most surrogate mothers listed poverty as the sole reason for their decision to carry a child for someone else. Some of them said that they just wanted to buy a house for the family, or they wanted to provide their children with education. One of them needed to get some health care for her child. So these were mainly the reason, but all of them related with poverty. Another problem was the lack of independent advice. Many surrogate mothers were illiterate, and their only source of information was the IVF clinic which was actually facilitating the arrangement, so there was no independent advice. Another problem was the lack of transparency in relation to the payments. The study revealed that fees were in all cases arbitrarily determined by the IVF clinic. And also lack of free will when taking a decision to become a surrogate mother. There were some concerns about pressure from families and IVF clinics to become a surrogate. Actually, there was one case which I read. It was a case where the surrogate mother decided, she was pregnant and she decided to abort her baby in order to become a surrogate mother, because she said that she couldn't actually afford to raise the child and she couldn't even afford to pay for her abortion. So the only way she was able to solve the situation was that the IVF clinic actually performed the abortion and then used her as a surrogate mother, which was quite sort of horrible. Anyway. So what is the Catholic teaching on surrogacy? So the teaching of the Church on surrogacy derives from the 1968 encyclical letter by Pope Paul VI about artificial birth control, Humanae Vitae, and the Church's 1987 statement by the Vatican Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith entitled Donum Vitae, Instruction on Respect for Human Life in its Origin and on the Dignity of Procreation. In these documents, the Church teaches about the implications of traditional and gestational surrogacy, understandably saying that both of these forms of surrogacy are wrong and not acceptable by the Catholic teaching. The reasons are as follows. First, the Catholic tradition sees marriage as both divinely instituted but also the most humanly compelling context for sexual expression. Sexual intercourse is the mutual giving of partner to partner, and marriage is the most ethically appropriate place in which to have and raise children. So accordingly, the Church says that a child is not only a gift of marriage, but also a living testimony of the mutual giving of his parents. For this reason, the Church speaks of the child's right to be the fruit of the specific act of the conjugal love of his parents. And the very nature of surrogacy actually rules such out. Many people compare surrogacy to adoption and wonder if adoption is morally praiseworthy, why not surrogacy, especially altruistic surrogacy. The Church responds that while very few cases of surrogacy are altruistic, paid surrogacy violates the dignity of the personhood, for only things have prices, but children are too valuable to be for sale. The Church advises that Catholics should not take the spiritual, ethical and legal aspects of surrogacy lightly. As surrogacy leads to killing of embryos, the gestational surrogacy, which involves production of more embryos that are actually used, as Deacon Tony has mentioned. So killing of embryos, which goes against the commandment, thou shalt not kill. Then surrogacy leads to the violation of the sanctity of marriage and family life, be it traditional or gestational surrogacy. So it goes against the spiritual connection between the mother, the father and the child. Especially commercial surrogacy leads to the exploitation of the surrogate mother, making her and the child a commodity. And surrogacy turns women into reproductive machines, leading to a confused parent-child relationship that ultimately damages the institution of family.